Sferrazza Anthony has done the impossible. In his new book, Camera Girl, The Coming of Age of Jackie Bouvier Kennedy, he has told the often forgotten and sometimes misunderstood origin story of a woman who accurately described herself as the art director of the 20th century. In his writings, he captures her subversiveness, her self-deprecating wit, and her passion for the power of language and words. More than John Kennedy's widow or being Jackie O, Sferrazza Anthony paints a portrait of a woman who knew her value and was unrelenting in her pursuit of her own individualism. Hello and welcome to At the Podium with me, Patrick Huey. At the Podium is a multimedia platform that brings together people from a diverse background of lives, careers, and experiences who all share one thing in common. They have stepped fully into the transformative power of finding and raising their voices to make an impact on the world we live in today. At the Podium holds a space for everyone to share their stories, to be heard, and to bring us inspiration. Today, I'm thrilled to share the podium with Sferrazza Anthony. Sferrazza Anthony is the author of a dozen books about presidents' wives and families, including As We Remember Her, Jacqueline Kennedy Onassis, and the words of her family and friends, The Kennedy White House, Family Life and Pictures, 1961 to 1963, and the two-volume First Ladies, The Saga of the President's Wives and Their Power, 1789 to 1990. He has served as guest curator for presidential libraries, written for numerous national publications, and served as contributing editor to the late John F. Kennedy Jr.'s George magazine. Carl, welcome to At the Podium.
Thank you, Patrick. Happy to be here.
It is a real pleasure to have you on. I know we're going to talk about Jacqueline Bouvier Kennedy Onassis and your book, Camera Girl, today. And it's like a fan moment for me because I love history. I love the Kennedys in particular, and that really sort of special moment after the 1950s, before the drama that happened in the 1960s. They hold this very special place in our historical landscape. So I'm very excited to talk to you because you are one of the top scholars on her in the country, and first ladies in general, and first families. So I'm very happy to be talking to you today.
Thank you. I appreciate that. And I like what you said, because one does see that with all of her preparation by reading history and really absorbing history and biography in the years before she married Jack Kennedy and then the years before they got to the White House, how she shaped the narrative of that period you speak of after the 50s, but before the drama of the 60s, and how she really gave it its shape and flavor by sort of being the zenith of American culture at its best. And that included everything from the promise of civil rights to the promise of technology with the space program, to the promise of humanitarianism through the Peace Corps and the Alliance for Progress. So I'm so happy you just mentioned that.
Yes. And one thing that I loved about the book, Camera Girl, is that I think we normally think about Jackie O, or whatever time frame you resonate with her. We really think about her as a finished product, particularly in today's world. And I think one of the great things about the book is that you give us a really in-depth view of the foundations that led to the mythology. You almost wrote her origin story in many ways, wouldn't you say?
That is so flattering, and that was always the intention. So thank you. Yes, that's exactly what the point of it was. And to also show people that just because you were a well-educated white girl from privilege in the 1950s, that there were still barriers, that there's still the significant social barriers to being a woman and the pressures and the expectations, and to being a Catholic. You know, she said very famously, I'm really an outsider. And I think she passed as the ultimate insider. She passed as being part of the Anglo-Saxon Protestant elite when in fact she was, Irish Catholic and French Catholic. And she never felt that she was part of that, although everyone assumed she was.
Right. And it's interesting because when you go in the book, towards the end of the book, once she has agreed to marry Jack Kennedy, and you start to see the machine of the Kennedys and the publicity machine that Joe Kennedy was really driving, he really drove home that narrative of her being the ultimate insider, which she wasn't.
You are correct. Now, it started with her being declared Deb of the Year, Debutante of the Year, which was the silliest moniker, she thought. And her stepbrother said, don't let that go to your head. But I think, a lot of people have sort of written novels and things about her and thought of her as a spy, because she was, in a way, she had the veneer of what passed as this perfect little society woman, but beneath it was something very subversive, very radical. And some of those ideas were born during her year in France, her year studying at the Sorbonne.
And you referenced this earlier. I got the impression from reading the book that she's really an inflection point for women. And she talks about, and you talk about in the book, there is this tension in the book between Jackie, if I can call her Jackie, and when she goes to become a writer and editor and for Vogue and then for the Times Herald, that there was a sort of tension between herself and this world that she was born into. It is a world of privilege and access and debutante balls and coming out and trips abroad. But there was also this moment in the book where it's those women writers at these magazines and newspapers who are really charting a new path for what modern womanhood could look like at the time that you're writing about for her. And I wonder where you would rate her in the importance of the women's rights movement. And would you view her as a feminist?
I would view her as a subversive feminist. I don't think it was until later in life that once she was in her 40s, starting with the age of 46 until her death at 64, that she really developed a conscientiousness about other women. Like so many, she was tough and she demanded her seat at the table. As Shirley Chisholm famously said, if you don't get a seat at the table, bring a folding chair.
Right.
And I think that's what Jackie did. But she did that as an individual, and she looked out after herself. She looked out that she got the writing assignments, but she had to beg and badger and push to get those. And I think she sort of just accepted the fact that she wasn't going to get paid as much as her male colleagues would have, but she still did the work because the work was what was important. In that sense, you could maybe say that she had the privilege of not having to worry about where she was going to live and how she was going to eat, because she was living in the grand estate of her stepfather. So she didn't have the same pressures that other working women among her colleagues may have had. But I would say she had a conscientiousness about sexism and a conscientiousness about bigotry simply based on her gender. But her connecting that with all women and seeing it as systemic and pervasive, that I don't think was a consciousness that happened until later in life.
Okay. And there was something else about this inflection point. And one thing that struck me in the book that you wrote about is that much of the narrative of the book takes place before television had entered the social conversation, which is fascinating to think about because she's a figure whose life was so defined by her ability to shape the visual narrative of her life. And she actually sees the power of television before it actually hit. I think it was her dressmaker, Rhea Minnie, who said that she was able to see around corners. And she goes to the editor of the Times Herald and it's like, do we own a television station? And so I think you place her pretty interestingly as this transitional figure almost, even in regards to her own understanding of what's coming around the corner for image.
Yes, I think that's very accurate. I think she lived in both worlds. She lived with a strong sense of the past, and yet a very contemporary conscientiousness. You see that reflected in the kinds of questions she asked. She was always asking about what's coming up. Do you think this will happen? Do you think that'll happen? She was always talking about the future, but she was also so imbued with the lessons from history. I think with Jackie, I have a friend coming up here.
Hi, friend.
My dog, one of the two dogs that kept me company through the pandemic while I was writing the book. But she, yes, she writes a TV documentary. And she also is fascinated by Jack Kennedy, who also has a very early sense of the importance of television and how it could play. But Jackie, with her love of photography and also her visual sensibilities that we saw, it manifested in her drawings. She did both realistic renderings of people as well as caricatures and cartoons of people. And then her photography, she did watercolors. I think she was a highly visual person, and she had a sense of the importance of TV. And of course, if you read those essays that she wrote about Vogue, she even talks about the work of different photographers. She talks about the drawings and the renderings and the pen sketches of famous artists of the time. And she, only using words, is able to convey an entire issue of Vogue page by page, what's in the top right corner and what's in the lower left corner, and what kind of font and what kind of colors. And she thought so visually, you know, and I think that only served her well with the advent of television, and then it served him well after their marriage.
Right. I mean, she was really able to orchestrate visually what that was all going to be.
That's well put. That's exactly right. Even down to the fact that she would begin to choose his suits and his ties and what she wanted, how she thought he should appear as a United States senator.
Right. And why do you think the sort of depth of who she was as a person and as a thinker? I had no idea that she wrote an 84-page, basically treatise on Vietnam that she gave to him as he was trying to build his profile around foreign policy. Why has that been so diminished within her? And people talk about her fashion, which is interesting, but I think she would probably be insulted a little bit by that if she were around to see how that's really become what she is kind of known for. And these bigger ideas, these bigger thoughts, her really erudite approach to life is just kind of vanished behind this idea.
Because we're a shallow society.
Yeah.
I mean, she was upset about that at the time during the White House years. She wrote about, she didn't want fashion stories making her out to be the Marie Antoinette of the 1960s. And later, when I was working on my manuscript for my first book, First Ladies, which is 2 volumes, she cooperated. She didn't give me an interview, but she helped through writing. And I had something about how people followed her fashions and her style. And she said, she added in the phrase, much to her annoyance. And yet she also understood the importance of the visual, the way she appeared, the way she wore the bloodstained clothes, so people could see the stark reality of the murder of her husband and what his real blood, meant as she came back with his body to the White House. And, the way she orchestrated the funeral that was televised, probably the first simultaneous event in the history of civilization, because that was carried live around the world. So she understood the importance of it. But I think even if you look at all the clothing, a lot of it's rooted in substance. And so she didn't mind using the style to hopefully draw attention to the substance. But even later on, when she worked with Cassini, the designer who did her White House clothing, she drew from history. She took female figures of Greek friezes on the side of buildings as the basis for her own original designs. And as I point out in the book, she did the same. She designed her own clothing.
Yes.
By adapting what she saw in the pages of fashion magazines, and as well as coming up with her own original, completely original creations. But I think it's the same reason why it's amazing to me that nobody ever wrote this book before me. It really is a little weird to me, but it's also this presumption that it's sexism is what it is. It's a presumption that nothing that interesting could possibly have happened to her before she became Mrs. John F. Kennedy.
I was curious as I started reading the book. My first question, I thought, well, how far is he going to go? Because as I was reading, I was like, oh, I'm hearing stuff I've never heard about her before. And you feel like you know her. And I was like, well, I know nothing about her. I know Dealey Plaza. I know the inauguration, the images of her on the boat, the life articles and the pictures, but like you don't know her. And of course, the CBS tour of the White House. And the mythology of that is also that it was at that point that JFK sort of understood what she was contributing to his administration. But it seems through what you're writing, he knew that all along.
Oh, yeah. He so appreciated what she did with that Vietnam research. There was only one columnist at the time. I can't remember his name. It's in the book, but only one columnist at the time who learned from Jack Kennedy that Jackie Bouvier had done this work for him as he prepared for the speech. I think it was coverage of him in a column, political column, as somebody who was emerging as the leading expert in Congress on the situation in Vietnam. And people also didn't even realize the extent of our involvement in Vietnam went back 20 years before we got out.
Right. And you talk about when he's in the Senate and she's sending him notes from the gallery.
Yes.
As she's listening to his speeches, and she's there when he's not even speaking, listening to the other speeches. She's actually sending him notes. And we always think of people like Abigail Adams and Lady Bird and Rosalind Carter as these sort of astute political partners, Nancy Reagan, to their husbands. And you really paint this picture of a very engaged Jacqueline Bouvier, soon Kennedy, to be Kennedy, in the political development of him.
Well, I think hopefully what the book will prove is that all of us are multidimensional. That a person of substance can also have style. That a stylish person is not shallow, but can be extremely well read. We create these categories and labels, and we say you're this or you're that, when in fact, even people do. And I've heard when people say I'm an extrovert or I'm an introvert, and maybe that's true 80% of the time, but it's not always true 100% of the time. And yet we write these narratives not only about others, but ourselves that are idealized and not reality. And, there's really a lot of sexism in our collective perception of Jackie as the wife and the mother and the fashion icon. But the problem is the way we have set up the dialogue, it's either or. It doesn't mean she's not a devoted wife and a devoted mother and very interested in her wardrobe. It just means she's also interested in other things.
Right. Foreign policy.
Yeah. And diplomacy and the art of diplomacy and using her skill and comfort in the world of words, her ability to vividly depict the most mundane things simply by her use of words. And that is both the skill and the knowledge that comes from writing a lot and reading a lot, but also thinking and using your imagination. I think that's another thing about her we forget. And people don't always understand that the idea of using having an imagination isn't always just about doing colorful oil paintings. It's also an imagination where you have a vision of democracy taking root in Southeast Asia, in countries like Vietnam, where you import these ideals that we fought for in World War II of equality and fairness and the right to vote. Jack Kennedy had that kind of an imagination. He didn't tell stories and drew drawings like Jackie, but he had a vision, and she loved that vision. And she bought into that vision about democracy. And that was born into her by the time in Europe, in France. Liberté, egalitarianism, fraternity, the idea of the French Enlightenment and the seeds of American democracy. This was important stuff to her. It's all abstract and conceptual, but it represents values. And I think that's another thing that's been overlooked about what she and he shared.
Mm. And do you think it was so present within her and with him because they were literally coming out of World War II, where that could have been actually lost? There was a real possibility that Hitler and Japan would have won.
Yes, I think you're absolutely right, especially him, of course, because that was always where his fixation was. I learned so much new material about him in this book, and how, this myth that he was pushed into politics. He wasn't. He was interested in politics before his brother Joe had died, before his father got in on the act. He was going around right after graduating from Harvard and wanting to meet the, political leaders and powerful people in Cambridge. He was a veteran of the Second World War. He was a reporter who wrote about the opening sessions of the United Nations, this newly created global organization to post-war to hopefully mediate conflicts. And she was of that generation too. She was more mired in history. But of course, one of the people who influenced her the most and later became one of her great friends was André Malraux, the French writer.
Right. Right.
And he lived in and wrote a lot about Indochina, about what is Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia. So, and then she learned a lot about the concepts of democracy and freedom and colonialism from her professor at the Institute of Politics at Sorbonne. And his name was Pierre Renouvin, and he was an expert on World War I and colonialism. So while Jack Kennedy saw the path to making a career out of these interests, I think Jackie saw the path of making a career out of him.
Right. I think in the book, you really show the negotiation that went on and the intentionality behind her befriending Ambassador Kennedy first, even before Rose Kennedy. Really how she made a decision that this is what she wanted to do and be. And in her letter to Joan Kennedy, Ted Kennedy's wife, she basically reveals it all. Like, I made these choices. You'll have to make these choices if you want to be with men who are going to be imaginative. Otherwise, marry Husted.
Yes.
Have that life that's, of just great ennui. But because oftentimes I think in the modern media, because again, I think we find value in victimizing her, or that may be too strong of a word, but there is a current ethos that she was a victim within this relationship of his affairs and all of that. But she knew that going in. I mean, it was Lynn Billings who sat with her and was like, listen, if you're going to marry him, you got to be clear about what this is. And she struggles in the book making that choice.
Yes.
And then she makes the choice.
Yes. And what's interesting, though, is how her sort of comeback, this is from a memo that was actually sold or publicly at an auction through an autograph company, a company that sells historical documents. It was a long memo she wrote, and I think it may have been raw notes that were made to help Rose Kennedy, as Rose Kennedy wrote her memoirs. But she writes about divorce, and she says, and Jack knew that divorce was unacceptable, that marriage was for life. And that was really her kind of comeback to the idea of it may not be a monogamous marriage, but it's not going to be one that ever ends in divorce. She had been through that trauma, and it had really traumatized her, and it had really shaped who her mother and father both became later in life, because they were so filled with acrimony and really destructive hatred for each other that it affected her life, not just as a child, but as an adult.
Right.
And she didn't want any, she just, she was very adamant about that. It's not until the 1970s when Joan Kennedy is struggling with staying in her marriage to Ted Kennedy that Jackie sort of concedes that divorce is at times ultimately very necessary.
You mentioned her parents, Jack Bouvier and Janet, and I was shocked at the level of physical abuse that her mother carried out against her, and the emotional sabotage that I would describe it as emotional sabotage. I don't know if you would describe it as such or if anyone else would, that was going on between her and her father, like over the car, all these things to keep her tethered to them both. And it was shocking because, again, that doesn't make it into the headlines of her life, that she had these really dysfunctional relationships with an abusive mother and an emotionally needy father and a sister who had a very severe eating disorder and felt completely left out of the whole equation of the three of them. It's quite an interesting dynamic that you chronicle.
I'm lucky enough to have had parents who never divorced. I think when you look at her, she was born in 1929 and her sister was born in 1933. And the acrimony began in 1936. So her sister was only 3 years old when it started getting ugly in that household. And I think those things affect, not only are we all different, including siblings, but the age at which you are in a certain stage of development, when the security or the sense of stability provided by a solid home life, without violence and emotional terror, that affects them differently. I think what's interesting is there's every indication that Jack Bouvier was a bit of a rogue and a runaround before his wife married him. And we have one letter he wrote her just 2 months after their wedding, in which he said, "You need to calm down. You need to relax. Just be your more natural, sweet self, and everything will be fine." And we don't know what the specific incident was that prompted that, but it was enough to give us an idea that she often got hysterical. And when she didn't get her way, she would go into a tirade, and that often had the effect of convincing people to give her what she wanted.
You wrote something in the book from the essay contest. So Jackie wants to get a job in Vogue, which she does. I mean, she writes the essay, she goes to this essay writing contest over a period of months. And she's writing about Baudelaire, Wilde, and Diaghilev. And she writes, "A common theory runs through their work, a certain concept of the arts." You write this, "a belief that beauty and art has nothing to do with the questions of good or evil." So she writes that about those men. And then she says, "I could be sort of overall art director of the 20th century, watching everyone from a hanging chair in space." And then she writes, "Mystery always helps." Those three quotes of hers that you reference really, to me, summed up who she was as a person at the time that you're writing. And I thought to myself, I wonder if this idea of looking at life beyond the sort of binary choices of good and bad and understanding what gray is allowed her to become Mrs. Kennedy, with all that we know that happened, what we think we know happened in that marriage. And then the art director comment made me think, was she the most influential woman of the 20th century, perhaps beyond Eleanor Roosevelt, maybe post 1950, 20th century America, when we really stepped into the century of America.
I think you may be right. I think, and part of that is not just her own sort of aesthetic, which was a blend of style and intellect.
Mm-hmm.
When she came into the public consciousness, there were terms like egghead and brainy. Sometimes they called her the brainy brunette as opposed to the dumb blonde. So all of it awful,
Right.
like you have to access their physicality in order to accurately describe it. And that was the attitude. Nobody says that about men. But it was also, derivative, because it was also about who she was married to. She had that visibility because she was married to the president of the United States. And so the cameras were always focused on her when she went around the world. So by the virtue of who she was, her status as the president's wife, that attention was brought to her. So one can't really say that, oh, well, she was the most stylish, most influential woman figure in the world, because maybe there were others, but because she had that position, she got that attention and she had that influence.
Hmm. And can you talk about, and it's related to what we're talking about, her relationship to fame? Because in the beginning of the book, she's clearly wanting to be famous. I mean, all of her writing, everything is related to this idea of being seen and being visible. She's very, very straightforward about that. She doesn't sort of shrink from that thought, at least in her letters to her friends and to her stepbrother, who she was very close with. And she gets it tenfold.
Yes. And I'm not so sure. I think in this part of her life, in Camera Girl, she's got idealistic, if perhaps naive, idea of what fame is. And then as First Lady, she's a little bit more protected because she does have Secret Service agent, and she's going from one high-hedged estate to another in and out of cars. And so she can control the downside of fame to a certain degree. But it's only later, as a president's widow and then as Onassis's wife, that you see her dealing with the downside of fame. And she doesn't like it. And, it's sort of like, it's a little bit of a spoil of her wanting it when she wants it and not wanting it when she doesn't want it. And she has to later on learn, after this book, but just to later on learn, as the famous song, you can't always get what you want.
No, you cannot. There's a great quote. It's her final Vogue essay, and she writes, "There is a loveliness in the whisper of another era, a softness and a shadow that have not had time to settle on our spanking new decade. We are none of us insensitive to an echo of the past." I love that quote because I was like, oh, well, that explains all the redecorating at the White House.
Yeah, well, and from her point of view, it was not redecorating so much as restoring,
Right.
Bringing to that place some idea in her imagination. Of course, we don't have photographs of what the Blue Room looked like under James Monroe. So it was all interpretive. And it was all, as is maybe not always obvious to people, but the White House is a stage set. Lighting is just right, the air and the height of the ceilings and the colors and the way they look during different times of the day, and so all of those things she was so acutely tuned into. When you saw her White House tour, she evokes the past, but she does it to remind us of the present. It's about democracy. And this is, of course, during the Cold War, when the non-aligned nations are paying attention to both the Americans and the Soviets, the communists, and communism and democracy. Which way are they going to follow? Who's going to help support them and provide infrastructure? And those non-aligned nations, this film was shown, her tour of the White House was, American propaganda. And if you listen to it, in between her description of the 19th century desk and this beautiful portrait is her reminding those who are listening that this is the temple of democracy.
Right.
That, the arts and the humanities flourished in the United States, that we may not have been as old as Europe, but we had quality craftsmen and we had people of vision, and we were not any stepchild. So that goes along with, I think, with what she wrote, that quote you provide. It is not always historical accuracy per se, but it's evoking a sense of nostalgia. It's evoking a time for the recent past and the faraway past that gives us a feeling. Emotional versus intellectual. And politics, as her husband famously said, that politics is about emotion, that people are moved by emotions. And I think they both understood that.
In your mind, is she Jacqueline Bouvier? Is she Jacqueline Kennedy? Is she Jackie O?
She's all of those things, but she's obviously, in this book, she's pure Jackie Bouvier. Mm-hmm. And I think it's important because, we all have things happen in our lives, right? That change us forever. You get married to this person and you have these children, that changes you. You become a living historical figure, that changes you. And the murder of her husband, even if it was a total stranger sitting next to you, that was filmed. And that would be seen by billions of people for the rest of time because it was captured on film. And it's gruesome. I don't like to remind people of this, but it's actually in her own words, in her testimony to the Warren Commission, that bits of his brain and blood and skull were in her mouth and in her nostrils and in her eyes. It's almost like Oedipal. It's almost like a Greek tragedy of her literally ingesting him. It's almost like mythological. Yes. It's horrifying, but you can't take away those parts of her from who she is in anyone's imagination. But that's why I wanted this book to end before the wedding. So it's all 100% Jackie Bouvier.
When you approach a subject like Jacqueline Bouvier Kennedy Onassis, even with eyewitness accounts and contemporaneous accounts, how do you get to the heart of who she was? Because I feel like so much of it is shaped by all that happened. And it all sort of feels like manifest destiny when you talk about it. How do you, as an historian and an author, capture who she really was?
Well, hopefully in the written record and the documentation she wrote herself, or anybody else for that matter. And that really is the most important thing, because no one's ever going to know. I hear you and I are talking. We could have a heart-to-heart, but I don't know what you're thinking. You don't know what I'm thinking. So we can only go by what those individuals share with us, tell us. Just as you quoted from her Vogue essays, I think it's the written word they leave behind, their own documentation of their own thoughts and experiences, which are the most authentic. And all that said, and this, of course, is talking more about the oral tradition rather than just the written, but her own stepbrother, Eustace, said in his written memoirs, she told me a lot of stories, and a lot of them were complicated and very detailed. You never really knew if it was the truth. You never knew if she was embellishing. You never knew if Jackie's desire to tell a great story overcame her desire to present the facts.
Right. Why do you write about her?
Because of her passion for writing, her passion for animals, her diligence. What a badass she was in terms of just getting the job done. Like, if you want to do something, you have just got to freaking, damn it, you just got to do it. You got to commit. and it's likely going to have consequences, maybe on your back, maybe on your eyes or your neck. Maybe you're not going to be able to go out to the parties you want to. Maybe you're not going to be able to go away for the summer. All of those things were true of her because she wanted to be, if after she got that newspaper column, that was, from her point of view, just a gateway. She wanted to be a feature writer, and she had to constantly badger her boss. People don't realize it's not just the Camera Girl column she wrote, but she wrote, I think it was a total of 6 full-length feature stories while she was at the paper. And she wanted to do so much more. And she was unrelenting. But that's how she got into, as a Vassar student, she got into the Smith program. She had to show that she excelled in French and was willing to commit to accelerated French classes. She did that. She did the work. Then she wanted that job at Vogue. She did the work, those essays. Then she wanted the job at the paper. I mean, at every turn, you see that she commits. And I'm fascinated by that. She didn't give up on herself. She did not abandon herself. I think that's a worthy example. And I hope that not just, younger people, not just women, but everybody who wants to change the circumstances of their life might find some moments in the book that help them to gather the wherewithal to do that.
I think that's totally there, because even the privilege she grew up with, she had to fight to get there. It wasn't just, like you said, she never had to worry about where she was going to eat or what she was going to eat or where she was going to sleep. But, overcoming her mother to take the trips to Europe and overcoming the toxic relationship between her parents, that's a lot for anyone to live with in their circle. And overcoming the messages you're receiving that you're supposed to be the Deb of the year. You're not supposed to be traipsing through France reading ancient French literature.
Right. And there was a significant amount of denigration of her physicality by her mother as well.
Yes.
And many people, I think, probably correctly so, some of her other biographers have said a lot of it had to do with the fact that she so closely resembled her father in the female form, that her mother, every time her mother saw her, she saw her ex-husband.
I think about popular portrayals of her. I think about Natalie Portman. I think about Blair Brown had a very sort of standout moment with her. I think Katie Holmes in the sort of unapproved version of the Kennedys. What do we get right about her in popular culture, and what do we miss about her?
I think when you're talking about history, I always say this: good history does not always make good drama. And good drama is very rarely good history. Most people would rather, watch a dramatization than read a book. And actually, this is one reason why I wanted to so completely slow down the story. This book really concentrates on 4 years, 1949 to 1953, with all of her earlier years being referenced. And that gave me the opportunity to explore things without summarizing it. And I think when you are depicting her dramatically, it's always in the context of her being the wife of, that, except for the movie Jackie and some of those miniseries, when she's the singular focus, so often it's in the context of her in-laws or her husbands, and really to see. And so I think, it's easier for me to say what I don't think is captured: her wit, her really biting wit. She never missed an opportunity to be self-deprecating, and she never missed an opportunity to compare people she knew to historical or literary figures. You should tell the story of how when they were driving through Ireland and through all these little villages, and that she would see the facial expressions of people in the small towns in Ireland, and she would say, "Oh, that looks like so and so from Ivanhoe."
Yes.
of whom there's not even a picture because it's a fictional character, but she was going on based on what she had in her imagination of who that character was. And it was already an obscure reference that became even more obscure. So I think sometimes they got that. I think her wit and her humor, and it was, she admitted in a letter she wrote to her Aunt Edie, Big Edie Beale of Grey Gardens, that she was a little eccentric like they were.
Yeah. Yeah. Who nurtured the love of history within you?
Probably my father. I mean, the truth is me. I did it myself. I nurtured it in myself, but to the degree that I did. But my father was an architect, worked on the World Trade Center, died a year ago. And he was a man very interested in the wider, larger world. And he, as an architect, was interested in historical architecture. So when we took family vacations, for example, when we went to Florida, he made sure we went to historic St. Petersburg. I'm sorry, here I am, the historian, and I messed that up. St. Augustine. We went to St. Augustine, the settlement there, and I could still vividly remember it, and the houses we saw. When we went up to Massachusetts, when he ran in the Boston Marathon, he took a day to take us to the Adams houses. We, did the drive on summer vacation down to Mount Vernon and Monticello, to historic sites in Maryland when we went to visit some relatives. So, his interest was largely coming from architecture, but and mine from the story of what went on in those houses. But, he loved reading history, and we always talked about historical figures. And one of the great things about doing this book was that during the pandemic, my mother died in 2020, and he was isolated and, living alone still in his house. And he was born 2 years after Jackie Bouvier, about 3 miles away. And so when I sort of started like, well, how did they get out from Manhattan to the end of Long Island? And what did they see? Well, my father remembered all of that. The smell of the duck farms and, the potato farms where Polish migrants, seasonal workers would come in, and the big signs for the suburban developments that were going on. But when they were taking the old turnpike, there weren't metal dividers, they were wood. And when it rained, you could smell the wood and the rope and those kinds of little details. So he had a mind like that, and that drew on his senses. And I think that influenced me.
You've had such a prolific career in history and in writing. What do you think has been your biggest leap of faith in your life or your career?
That I could support myself as a writer. And sometimes I've been able to do that better than at other times. You have to think about the exciting feeling and the being in the flow when you are creating, when you're writing, because that's where the satisfaction comes. It sure ain't coming from annual trips to Europe, which I wish I had, but you learn to have your fun and excitement where you can find it as a writer. And that is so often in the mind, in the imagination. And I remember thinking, well, when you go to Europe, you're getting on things that are moving you there, like, cars and airplanes and trains, but everything you're seeing is also just something you're experiencing in your imagination. So I learned to be more satisfied with the pleasure I was deriving from writing as I would have perhaps had I been traveling more extensively.
I have a final question for you. What has your work around Jacqueline Bouvier Kennedy Onassis, what has it taught you about yourself?
That I like people who are I think there's a word that she used a lot and that I used a lot in the book and that I use in my own life: individualism. Somebody who has the courage to develop their own passions and not be dissuaded from pursuing those passions just because they might seem unconventional. And I think that is the most striking thing about her, is, as for lack of a better word, her commitment to individualism. And I don't mean like she never saw the value of people banding together. I mean, hell, that's how her damn husband got elected president. You go out and campaign and you change minds and you influence people and you get as many people as possible to vote. She understood that, but in terms of herself, she was so highly individualistic. She was individualistic in grade school. It was commented on by her teachers how odd or unusual she was. It was commented on frequently by her mother, used the term derisively, her wild imagination.
Yeah.
It was that way at the newspaper. Among all of her colleagues, she stood out just as people thought she was a little odd and a little weird, maybe, and a little eccentric. She stood out among the Bouvier cousins. She stood out among the Kennedy family. She stood out among the Senate wives. And then in this sort of panoply of first ladies, she stands out. She was always individualistic. And I think I'm that way too. Not that I try to be, I just know it feels better to be into the stuff you're into.
Yeah. Yeah. Carl, thank you so much for talking to me today about your book. I loved it. I love the book.
Thank you so much. It means a lot. Those are the words, every writer cherishes above all others. So thank you very much.
Yes. And everyone, please read this book. It's so readable, which I think is one of the brilliant parts of the book, is that it's so readable, and you get who she is as a person. There's so many surprises. So I hope everyone reads it. And thank you again, Carl.
Thank you, Patrick. This was terrific.
Yes. And to those of you who are watching or listening, remember, we all have a voice. Use yours wisely. Bye, everyone. Thank you, Carl.
Thank you, Patrick.